Hi guys, my name is Danae Brazil and today we're here for another week of F1 driver ratings for the Hungarian Grand Prix, which turned out to be quite an interesting race. It ended up being, I'd say, quite a bit busier than I thought it would, considering it's not a great track for overtaking, and we definitely saw the problems with that. But I do think strategy-wise, it was very interesting, and there were also some other things going on that we certainly need to talk about. So I'm going to get straight into it, starting with Aston Martin, who finally I can actually talk about in a way that feels somewhat productive. We actually have things to discuss because the upgrades have worked, at least around the Hungaroring, which is great to see. So we will start with Fernando Alonso, who I am giving a 7 out of 10. I will say it felt really hard rating the Aston Martin drivers today because the results are so much better than what they've done the rest of the season because of the upgrades that it would be quite easy, I think, to overrate this drive. So I was really trying to not do that. So I think a 7 is fair for Fernando. I think getting out of Q1, even though it took 3 sets of tyres to do so, is very well done for Aston. As Fernando said post-qualifying, being able to feel like he could influence the result was a nice change, and I have to agree, it was nice to see him up there. Even if it is still in 16th, that is an improvement, so that is a positive. And then in the race, up into 14th, I think that's a pretty good drive. I don't know why he ended up finishing behind Lance Stroll, but aside from that, it was just a good solid drive. I'm glad to see Fernando up fighting a bit more. That is good to see, so I think a 7 is fair. And then on to Lance Stroll, I'm also going to give him a 7 out of 10. Down 20th in qualifying still, which isn't phenomenal in comparison to Fernando. The fact that their qualifying gap is so immediately bad again as soon as the car works, I don't think is a good sign for Lance Stroll. But then in the race, up into 13th, again, that is a good drive, I think, and worthy of a 7, even though I didn't really see him all that much. Thank you so much, F1 TV, for the fucking TV direction again, where it feels like we don't see half the cars. But I think a 7 is fair as well for Lance. Next up is Cadillac, who, once again, I cannot rate because Perez and Bottas qualified on the back row, and then they both DNF'd with mechanical problems. They were absolutely nowhere. They are now definitively the worst team on the grid, so there's really nothing I can say. The drivers do not influence this at all, so there's nothing to rate because the car is slow and then it doesn't work. So it's just not possible for me to give them a rating. Next up we have Williams. I'm going to start with Carlos Sainz, who, I'm going to be honest here, I might be being harsh with this grade, but I think some of what Carlos did today was unacceptable, and therefore I'm giving Carlos Sainz a 3 out of 10. I cannot even begin to describe how angry I was when I saw him hit Oscar Piastri as Oscar was trying to unlap himself. I get that there were problems with the blue flags in this race, all of those things, sure. However, your car has fucking mirrors on it, use them. It is actually that simple. Your car has mirrors, use them, especially when you're driving a Williams and you can see a bright orange car behind you. You know that can only be a McLaren and you're not fighting them on pace. So clearly that's a car that needs to get past you, let them. It's already bad enough that him and Fernando were blocking Oscar because they were too busy fighting each other to check for blue flags. But to then drive into Oscar Piastri is absolutely unacceptable. To be honest, I don't really care too much about what else Carlos did this weekend, although I'll say he was slow because the Williams was slow and that's about it. This probably would have been a 5 out of 10 grade if he hadn't have gotten into this incident with Oscar Piastri, but he did. So it's a 3. It is absolutely, again, unacceptable to have hit one of the leading cars that was fighting for possibly a race win, but definitely a podium. It's just ridiculous. And then also post-race to justify it by saying that he was racing. Yes, but you're not racing a McLaren, Carlos. I don't know if he forgot that he doesn't drive for Ferrari anymore or what the fuck, but ridiculous. Ridiculous to justify it, ridiculous driving from him. I am so beyond annoyed by this. So it is a 3 out of 10 for Carlos Sainz. And next up we have Alex Albon, who I'm giving a 5 out of 10 because the Williams was just really bad and all he kind of did was drive it to where it was going to go. Genuinely, the onboards from Williams this week were bad. I don't understand what was going on with the car, and clearly the team and the drivers didn't really seem to know either. So it's really hard to rate for that, but in that case I just have to give Alex Albon a 5 because I can't give him higher because it's too hard to tell what is driver and what is the car that is the problem. So I just have to, go straight down the middle with that one. Next up we have Alpine. I'm going to start with Franco Colapinto, who I swear I didn't see once in this race. I'm giving him a 5. I think he kind of performed to where the Alpine should be, maybe a little slow in comparison to Gasly. Certainly, he finished in 15th compared to Gasly finishing 12th, despite them qualifying next to each other, so it's not ideal for Franco, but it was fine. Again, it's hard to grade when I feel like I didn't see a driver at all during the race. So yeah, it's again another just straight down the middle sort of drive for Franco. He kept out of trouble at least, which I think is a positive. Moving on to Pierre Gasly, who I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. Finishing 12th in the Alpine in the kind of state it was this weekend, I actually think is probably kind of the best it could do. I think that was pretty well driven. He's, pretty definitively ahead of Franco all weekend, and then, kept it tidy. I don't think he really could challenge the Audis or the Racing Bulls too much. So I think it's kind of fair for him to end up in 12th, and so I think a 7 is a fine grade for that. Next up we have Audi. I'm going to start with Nico Hülkenberg. I'm going to give an 8 out of 10. Finally, he's got some points on the board this season. I'm very happy to see that. It feels like he's been driving to a level that should have already rewarded him with points, and it's unfortunate that's taken this long, but at least he's finally here. It was a good, solid drive. Kept out of trouble, was fighting, with the midfield quite well, and then, picked up some points. So I think that's a good drive overall for Nico, so it's an 8. Next up we have Gabriel Bortoleto, who I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. Not the worst. Qualified 4 places behind his teammate though, which isn't ideal. And then finished in 11th, so 2 places behind Nico. So I don't think it was too bad. I think again he kind of finished where that car should be. I think that's fair. I think in amongst the Racing Bulls and that sort of pack, I think is kind of where I expect the Audi to be. So I think it's a fine week for Gabby, just not as good as his teammate ultimately, so he gets a point less than him, which is a 7. Next up we have the Racing Bulls. I'm going to start with Liam Lawson, who I'm going to give a 7.5 out of 10. I'm actually starting to find it, I will say, quite hard to rate Liam because he's kind of always in the points now, always the kind of top end of the midfield, and I have given him a lot of high grades for it as is deserved. But I do think now it's like I can't give him a top grade every time when clearly that just is where the car should be, like I do think it is getting hard now for me to know when it's a really good drive and where it's just the car, like he's achieving what the car should achieve versus what is like really impressive driving from him. But I think this weekend was pretty good. I think qualifying was a little disappointing. I know he was disappointed to not get it into Q3. It's fair enough, but I don't think 11th is like the absolute worst. He's on the cusp of it, so I don't think he should be too upset by that. I'm certainly not. And then in the race, he ended up finishing ahead of his teammate, his best of the rest once again. He is easily performing the best of the midfield drivers. He is maximising that car every week now. And so I think it is, God, right, I've just said all that. Maybe I am leaning towards an 8 out of 10. I was like, it's a 7.5 because he's always this good, but maybe, as I've just said, that he's maximised the car. The worst he did was qualifying, so I don't know. I guess I'm leaving it at 7.5 if I feel the qualifying was really that bad, but otherwise I might upgrade this to an 8 when I'm editing. we will see. There's always at least one driver where we will see what I grade them when I'm editing this later. But anyway, moving on to Arvid Lindblad, I'm going to give him a 7.5 out of 10. I think this was good. Qualifying was a really well done from Arvid, I will say. It looks like at one point that he could really kind of challenge up higher in the order. I don't quite know what happened in that final sort of Q3 run for him, but even then qualifying 9th I think is still well done. And then yeah, still finished with a point. I will say obviously there he does benefit by what happened to Oscar Piastri, and that is the reason why he kind of is in the points positions. But even so, you know, you have to be there to, you know, capitalize on other people's misfortune. It's a part of the sport, and I think overall it was a pretty good race from Lindblad. Not one of his best, not one that was super impressive, but I think good still. I will say with the V-Cubs, once again fighting wheel to wheel, that there's just an incident waiting to happen. As I said last week, it feels like tensions are just building and building. Hopefully the summer break maybe cools those a little, but I just think there will be a race very soon where Lindblad and Lawson do collide. It's so close every time. And I will say I didn't love today that we saw their very close wheel-to-wheel battling was directly in front of a Max Verstappen that was trying to lap them. I didn't love that. Max made it very clear that he didn't love it either. His radio for that was very entertaining. But yeah, certainly feels like the Racing Bulls, it's building and building to something big happening between their drivers, because this is now the past, 3 or 4 Grand Prix that they've been really close to contact. And I just think, you know, time is ticking there. It will happen eventually. Next up we have Haas. I'm going to start with Esteban Ocon, who I'm giving a 6 out of 10. It was a fine race. I will say he was the better Haas this weekend, so he gets an extra point for that. You know, qualified up in 15th, finished 16th. It was pretty anonymous, I will say, but not the worst. That car is just clearly quite a handful as well, so I don't blame him too much there. But yeah, I think a 6 out of 10 is fair for that drive. And then Ollie Behrman, I'm going to give a 5 out of 10. Essentially, it's just he was worse than his teammate and the car isn't very good, so he gets a point less than him. But otherwise, like, it was fine from Ollie. He clearly wasn't having a great time this weekend. The car just didn't seem to click for him for whatever reason. So a 5 I think is fair. Next up we have Red Bull. I'm going to start with Isaac Hadjar. I'm giving a 7.5 out of 10, I think. Again, really hard to grade Hadjar at this point, so I kind of think like finishing 6th is where that car should be, maybe even a little higher. Again, maybe there's a world I up this to an 8. It's so hard to tell, like with Hadjar in particular. Hadjar and Lawson are the two that I struggle to grade, I feel like every week, unless they have a super standout drive, because they kind of are maximising where I think the car should be, but then like it's not super impressive, so where do I grade that? So I think like there's a world in which I up this to an 8, but also I do think like a 7.5 might be fair. We'll see how I feel about it. Obviously he spun out in qualifying in Q2, but because Max also spun out, I'm really more attributing it to the car being a problem. If both of your drivers are spinning out and qualifying in pretty similar ways despite it being different corners, I kind of think that is more of a car stability problem than a driver error. So I'm not really going to degrade either of them for that. So yeah, I think maybe it is an 8 for Isaac Hadjar. I don't really know what else more he could have done. So yeah, maybe I will up it to that. And next up we have Max Verstappen, who I'm giving a 10 out of 10. Just know that like I am ultimately, above all else when I watch the sport, a Verstappen fan. So know that there probably is like an extra half point added here, just of I cannot believe he somehow came second in this race and I am very excited about it. Like, just know that this is a biased ranking. When I talk about Max Verstappen, I am the most biased possible. So don't get mad at me in the comments. I know I'm being biased here. That's fine with me. Ultimately, these are just unserious ratings on a topic I'm not qualified to speak about at all. So I can be biased about my favourite driver sometimes, okay? But no, seriously, I do think this was an impressive drive from Max. Obviously, there was a spin in qualifying. Again, the rear of the car looked all over the place for both Max and Isaac. Again, I would downgrade for this if it was only Max that spun. But again, they both did, which means I do have to start looking at the car being a problem. Obviously, it wasn't the same rear wing problem that we saw him have in Austria or Silverstone. There's clearly still something in the stability at the rear of the car that is off. And Max and Isaac both still throughout this entire race were complaining of problems with the car, various downshifting problems, aero problems, stability problems. So I do think he was still kind of fighting an uphill battle here. But ultimately Max held on for dear life today. This was really, I think, a race that was purely his will made this happen. That overtake on Lawson and Hamilton was phenomenal work. The fact he gained places off the start as well, made life difficult for the Ferraris, was very good. And yeah, I think McLaren should also be very grateful to Max Verstappen today, because I think he gave them the space to speed off into the distance, because Lewis was stuck behind him for so long. And right as it felt like Lewis had, won out in that first round of pit stops, he then lost out again by an incredible move from Max. Sometimes I feel like I'm reminded of why I love this sport when I watch Max Verstappen, is when he does a move like that one that is so on the limit, like it kind of shouldn't work. Like there's a world in which that goes so terribly and it's race ending for like all cars involved, but somehow he manages it, and it was just one of those today. And honestly, that move alone I would just give a 10-4 to be fair, but I think it was a well-managed race. He was clearly still having problems with the car. The tyre deg, especially on the hard tyre, is not great for Red Bull. But yeah, I think it was a really good drive, over-delivered massively of what this car is capable of. So I think a 10 out of 10, as much as it is definitely a biased grade for me, I wouldn't say it's unfair. Next up we have McLaren. I'm going to start with Oscar Piastri, who I am giving a 9 out of 10 still, because none of what happened to Oscar this weekend was his fault. This felt like just the universe once again wanted to make Oscar Piastri's life difficult. Starting with qualifying, I will say he was not on Lando's pace in qualifying anyway, but then he didn't even get to do his Q3 lap, his final run, because he was massively impeded by Lewis Hamilton. Like, Ferrari, communicate with your drivers more effectively. Lewis, please look in your mirrors, especially considering Lewis did his final Q3 lap so early. It should have been pretty obvious that there would be cars pushing behind him for him to look out for. So I don't know how he didn't notice at all, that the team didn't communicate that at all. But yeah, so that was the beginning of a rough time for Oscar Piastri. Although I will say I do feel like the penalties that Hamilton and Antonelli racked up in qualifying, which we'll get to, did in some ways maybe benefit him, because he ended up starting third, and I don't think he would have qualified that high without those things occurring. So in some ways I feel like it may have been helpful, but still not great to be impeded, obviously. Then we get to the race. A phenomenal lap one from Oscar Piastri, a really great move on his teammate, kept it tidy, and then was off. Yeah, both McLarens had really good pace in this first stint especially, and Oscar was doing a really good job here. Then we go through the pit stops, all is well, until Carlos Sainz hits him. I've already gone over it talking about Carlos, ridiculous. And I've never heard or seen Oscar Piastri so angry before, and he is completely justified to be absolutely fucking enraged as he was, because just unbelievable. So yeah, be trying to pass lap traffic as one of the leading cars fighting for a race win and be hit is, yeah, as I said before, unacceptable. And then managed to deal with that. McLaren then chose to obviously take advantage of Oscar's misfortune there. to pit Lando because they knew Lando would now have the gap with his pace. And again, I understand why Oscar's very angry about that. Like, it's very clear the team did choose to capitalise on their own driver's misfortune in that case. And while I do think Lando was the faster McLaren, and I understand why they did it, I do think it was probably a smart move to make. I also think Oscar is well within his rights to be very angry about this. And then obviously he ends up DNFing from gearbox failure. It just feels never ending for Oscar Piastri this season. Like, he gets in a good drive and then it all collapses because of no fault of his own. It sucks. I feel so bad for him today. But it still was, on his end, a really good drive, and therefore it is a 9 out of 10. And then next up is Lando Norris, who I am giving the easiest 10 out of 10 I've probably given all season, to be honest. He was just the best driver on track all weekend, it feels like. In qualifying, even without, obviously, the chaos that happened towards the end after Max spun, Lando was still going to put in the best lap no matter what. He just had everyone's number, especially in the first sector. His first sector time was absolutely crazy every run in Q3. And then in the race, obviously got passed by Oscar on lap 1, not ideal. He said himself it wasn't a good lap 1 from him. I think that's fair, but made up for it in the rest of the race. I really think that no matter what had happened with Oscar, Lando still would have won this. His pace was absolutely ridiculous. He was so fast, he kept it clean, just a very solid world champion's drive from Lando Norris, which I'm so happy to see for him. It really has felt like he's not had the chance to show off his skill as a champion this season, and this drive was a champion's drive. I mean, I've said repeatedly this season, I think this is the best he's ever driven. I think he's been really consistent when the car has been working, and he's been fast and tidy. He hasn't done anything stupid. I think he's been very good this season, and this race I think finally was the culmination of that, and I'm very happy to see it. A great drive, a very easy 10 out of 10 to give out. Next up we have Ferrari. We're going to start with Lewis Hamilton, who I'm giving a 6.5 out of 10. This was a weekend where Ferrari, and especially Lewis Hamilton, should have made massive progress in the fight against Kimi Antonelli. And Lewis instead had a weekend that I think was plagued with mistakes and costly ones. So starting with qualifying, I don't know what happened in those final Q3 runs for both Ferraris, why they were so slow. They had just nothing left. I don't know what happened there. But then to impede Oscar Piastri so massively, take the 3-place grid penalty, not a good start. Down in 5th starting is not a good sign. Then opening stint, he's stuck behind Max for so long, couldn't get past Max really at all. So then pit early, managed to get ahead of Max in that first round of pit stops. Then when he was overtaking Liam Lawson, didn't really pay attention to what was going on behind him and left the door open for Max to make that insane move. And that was, again, another mistake that cost Lewis. And then we had another penalty for speeding in the pit lane. And while yes, I do agree, like he's been given a lot of penalties this season, and I do think last weekend's penalty was unfair. I said that, but for him to complain about this, you either speed in the pit lane or you don't. And I do think like Lewis Hamilton knows better, or if it's Ferrari's fault, then Ferrari knows better. But either way, just it's not good enough. Like, to get a penalty speeding in the pit lane is ridiculous. And that was another position loss for him at the end of the day. And I really am struggling for words for this. I'm so frustrated by Lewis Hamilton's weekend because it feels like he had everything to work with. The car was good. He had a good qualifying position. He could have really had a shot at winning this race if he had actually started on the front row where he qualified, because Lando still would have made that mistake on lap 1 and would have left the door open, and Lewis would have taken advantage of it. And I think if he had been leading this race from the beginning, he could have won it. But instead, penalties and mistakes galore led to a pretty mediocre weekend at a track that Ferrari should have been good at and that Lewis has historically been very good at, and he's just kind of left with a pretty average weekend. So it's a 6.5 for me. And then on to Charles Leclerc, who I feel like I barely saw in this race. I'm going to give him a 7. Really, it's just that he was pretty slow. It wasn't super impressive. He obviously lost places on the start, but I'm giving him half a point more than his teammate because at least he didn't make a bunch of mistakes that resulted in penalties. That's really my only positive for Charles Leclerc, because he lost places on the start and then just was kind of nowhere, was stuck behind the Max Lewis battle, and then, eventually got passed by Kimi, obviously, and it was a pretty nothing weekend from Charles Leclerc, which is unfortunate considering his most recent form has been really good. And then finally we have Mercedes. I'm going to start with Kimi Antonelli. I'm giving a 9 out of 10. This was a really hard one to grade for me, but again, he got the penalty for the yellow flag infringement in qualifying. I get that he tried to do it Georgia and Austria. I do think that the penalty went through this time. One, because I think the FIA got so much shit for not penalising Georgia and Austria that they felt like it was necessary to give this penalty. But also, I think the big difference was in comparison to Austria, which I do think George should have gotten that penalty there, let me make that clear. But I do think that the difference here as well is that Max was very close to the track where he spun out here versus Austria. He's way away in that gravel trap. But, this final corner, he's not really that far from the exit of the turn. He was pretty close to the track, so I do think that was also taken into account probably. So I get why they gave Kimi the penalty. I'm not massively downgrading him for that, but it is important to mention as a part of his weekend because it did result in him having a more difficult race than he probably would have otherwise. I still don't think Kimi would have won this if he'd started higher. I think Lando and Oscar, to be honest, were pretty untouchable. So I don't think the race win was ever really on for Kimi, even if he'd started up and fourth. But it was still a good race from him. I did think he was probably going to make it through the pack a little quicker, but again, it wasn't bad. Kimi's been so impressive this season. It's hard to watch a weekend like this where I feel like it was still a super good, solid drive. But because I'm not super impressed either, it's hard to feel like I could rate him higher than a 9. So I think I'll leave it there. And then finally we have George Russell, who, God, what a weekend for him. Q3, I don't quite know what went on. His lap, I think, was the most interrupted by Max's spin because, I think Max was kind of rejoining right as George was finishing his lap out, which is unfortunate for him. But even then, his pace was not good in qualifying, so I don't think he would have really made it much higher up the order anyway. And then, in the race, Andy stalled on the start. Now, I was willing to give George the benefit of the doubt with this, to be honest, because obviously I have done so with the Red Bulls especially, but also other drivers who have had issues with the starts because these cars seem to sometimes just not want to start. But then Kimi explained what happened in the cool-down room, and it could immediately identify that George had made a mistake. And I think that is the real killer for George Russell. And that anti-stall was the real killer of his race overall. Obviously dropping back down to 20th and having to make his way through the pack, which I thought he did a decent job of. I did kind of assume he'd make it through the real back markers a bit quicker. And I thought he would approach the back of Hadjar maybe a little sooner. But yeah, it's a tough one to grade, but I think because it is still a weekend that's kind of plagued by mistakes and issues for George as well, I think it has to be a 6.5 in a similar way to how I've considered Lewis Hamilton's weekend. Also, end of Q3, apparently water leaked into his engine. I don't quite know what's going on there. It feels like, yeah, George Russell is both very unlucky but also is making mistakes, and the combination of those things is leading to a pretty rapidly collapsing title charge, and it really starting to feel like it's just not on the table for him anymore. And that is it for driver ratings for the Hungarian Grand Prix. That felt like a lot to cover this week. I'm terrified to see how much footage I have to edit, to be honest. But yeah, now we have the summer break. I don't think I've ever been so excited for a break from F1, to be honest. Also, obviously, we have the news that the Bahrain Grand Prix will be held in Sepang in Malaysia. Very strange, that one, but I'm so glad to see Sepang back on the calendar. I do love that track, although I'm concerned about the straights with these regulations with cars. But they'll be interesting. Also, will be fascinating to see because it's been off the calendar for so long. I saw a graphic that someone made showing that like pretty much half the grid have never raced at Sepang. So I think this will be very interesting. A lot of the younger drivers wouldn't have bothered with this on the simulator either, obviously, because they didn't think they would be racing there. So I do think it will be a very interesting race on the calendar, and I'm very glad to see it. But yeah, other than that, summer break. I will also be making content here. Let me know in the comments if you want my driver ratings for the first half of the season. And if so, would you like me to just average out all of the grades I've given the drivers so far? Or if you would like me to just rate them based on how I'm feeling kind of more generally about their driving this season. And I also, I'm looking to probably make like 2 videos during summer break. Hopefully I'll also make some film commentary because I haven't done that in a while. Although to be fair, not many of you watched my last one about Sean Baker's filmography. If you haven't seen that and it sounds interesting to you, you should watch it. I really did have a great time making that video and I really like it. So if you would like to see some more from me while I'm maybe not uploading as much because there's no F1 on, let me know. And then yeah, otherwise, if you liked this video, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see even more from me, please hit subscribe. And if you'd like to see even more from me, you can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Letterboxd, all those things we linked down below. And those places you can see my makeup and special effects work and whatever else I'm up to and all the usual things. This is a horrific version of my outro, but I can't be bothered redoing it. So that will be all for this week. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next video. Bye.